I figured after all this new material and after you know, all the introductions and showing how to do things, that it might be good just to back up and talk about some of the features that are in DataFlex that you might have missed about. And the good news is this isn't going to be highly technical. There is a rule that says when you use the word Nifty in any kind of presentation, it's not going to be highly technical until somebody comes up with an acronym that and now we're using Nifty programming. So why the talk? New versions of DataFlex are being released on a very regular basis, and each version, I mean, big new things come, and that's what we talk about. It's like this time we're talking about managed connections, but we're talking still a lot about web app because there's this whole new web app framework, and then there's this web app mobile framework, and with each release, there's a lot of other really nice features that come in. We talk about them when they come out, and then we don't talk about it much after that. We just assume you all know about it, you all remember it, but they tend to be forgotten about, and these small improvements all start to add up. They really, in fact, one thing I would hope as you were watching presentations, you would be going, oh, how did he do that? That seemed like a neat thing. You know, what was that? And so what I want to do is just review some of these. And the other thing is to remember is that not everyone, we're accepting that everyone is not up to the latest version, and this is not like a clever attempt to shame you or something and say, why aren't you using the latest version? Because we completely understand why you don't. And then the other thing is, even if you are up to the latest version, you may not be using the latest features. You know, one person's indispensable feature is another person's, why in the world are you using this? So this is going to be a fairly quick review, not real technical. And let's see what things we've forgotten about. Something we haven't talked much about this conference at all is data dictionaries and what's new, what has been added to data dictionaries. And you notice the one I put up at the top there, which was added a while back in 17.0. I'm not going to mention the versions. The reason the numbers are there is so if you're not up to the latest version, you can go, oh, you can, whatever version you're running, you can say, yes, I have that feature. No, I'm not there yet. Local DD relationships allow you to model custom relationships at the data dictionary level, which means you don't have to go into your table and make a hard change in the relationship that may break all other parts of your application. And I think it was, I was talking with Marco about that, where he said for him that was a game changer. That made parts of his applications, you know, like things that were just so difficult, so hard to work with, the best thing ever. And if you haven't had a chance to work with this, you might want to put down your list and say, okay, I'd like to review this. Maybe lots of things I'm doing you know, could be made simpler there. Number 2 on the list is the SQL DD filters. When Eddie gave his talk today and was saying, we've got this view, but it's very slow, but then you need to do a DD filter, what he was talking about was using an SQL DD filter. And what does that do? For those of you that aren't familiar, it lets you, at the data dictionary object level, say, when you're finding records and when you're doing things with the record set, here's a filter that we want you to apply it to, and the server applies that filter and only brings back the records that are valid for that filter. Why would you want the server to do it? Because the server can do it orders of magnitude faster than it can be done by bringing in every record and making the decision yourself. And I believe it was Michael Mullins who referred to this as being the SQL DD filters are something magic, yeah. Powerful stuff. If you haven't had a chance to play with them and you're in SQL, it's nice stuff. Another change that came along is better handling of deleted records in views. If you had the situations where, especially with grids or when you're switching views, that you start getting error messages because one user deleted something, the other person didn't know about it, that problem has pretty much gone away. Data dictionary performance. There's a new DD buffer, so it's much faster. That really matters if you have a lot of columns and you have a lot of tables at one time. But it just turns out the internal, we moved it into C, but the more important thing was the internal algorithm that was used is just faster. The attach is faster. There's this thing called Smart Relates, which I just write it down if you're not sure about it. But what it did is it made relates work the way you probably always thought they did in a data dictionary object structure, which is if the parent wasn't there, it wouldn't be doing the find. Well, it was doing the find, and now it doesn't. And what that means is a lot of database activity just disappears. This use of extended fields uses less memory. This has something to do with another technology I'll talk about in a second, but what it really means is when you have big comment fields or big text fields in your data dictionaries, and you have lots and lots and lots of data dictionaries, each data dictionary used to reserve enough space for the worst case comment load. Now they're all small. It grows to whatever size it needs, so it needs a lot less memory. You have more control over cascade deletes. We've improved constraints. There's this whole thing about null parent support that was added, and this was like, some people say no, never have a null parent. Other people said fine. We remained agnostic about whether you should use it, but we provided support. So this is a very simple way to say, for this parent, make it a null, and the data dictionaries work fine. There are some pre-find, post-find events that always get called for any type of find. There's this new feature called DD Remember, which is basically replaces the old retain and retain all, and can be set at an individual user level. And then there's this thing called committed records, which is a new type of validation, so that you don't, depending on the state of your record, saved, not saved, the parent saved, not saved, you can't make changes in it. So that's a lot of new changes. There's this thing called the DD debugger, and this is one of these products, one of these pieces that either people use all the time or they've never heard of it, or they heard about it but they forgot about it. Well, it's gotten better and better, and as significantly, there's a web version of it now. And that might be worth showing, because in a way, we kind of hid that one. To bring up the web border, what you have to do is and this is a debugging tool, and that's why we did not put it in the sample, because it... Okay. Oh, why would that be? Let's try. Yeah. No. We're almost there. We're there. All right, old-fashioned way. Sometimes. I'll master this yet. Anyway, what you'll see is that there's all kinds of files in the web order. If you wanted to add the debugger, you just go in. It's good this is as technical as I'm going to be getting, because I'm forgetting how to do things. And add the debugger. Now how do you do that? Use web DD debugger. Compile it. And what this lets you do is, while you're running a web application, you can inspect your data dictionaries and see what's going on. And let's open the application. So you're up, you've got a record. You just press Control-D. And there's this nice visual data dictionary inspector. You can look at your different records. You can check your constraints. You can do that. You can do the exact same thing in Windows. It's that easy to add that to your web application. Of course, you want to remove it before you deploy it. Otherwise, your users will be able to do the same thing. But as I said, for some people, this is an indispensable tool. And for others, it's like, oh, I forgot it was even there. Same thing is available on Windows. It's a great tool. And let's see if I. Okay. So then the other thing just wanted to talk about, and you'll notice I'm jumping all over the place here. There's features everywhere. is there's a lot of new language and class capabilities that have been added over recent versions. Make sure you remember about them. One of them is there's a whole bunch of new date and date time functions. That all these things where you need to do date math manipulations, add this, subtract this. Perhaps the most significant thing is there's now a function that says set this date variable to a date where you pass it year, month, and day as variables instead of in a formatted string. So you don't have to keep track of what region you're in. It'll be the exact same syntax whether it's in Europe or whether it's here or whatever. There's also all these date add functions where you can say, I've got a date, add 3 months, add 5 months, subtract 5 months. I can't remember, there's like 20 new functions, and they do all kinds of date manipulations. Pretty nice stuff. There's these compile time functions called the ref functions that we've also added ref table to, which is when you create ref table, you then put in the name of the table and the column, and it looks nicer, the code is clean, it's self-documenting, and CodeSense can use it. So there were a bunch of new array functions added where you could say, is this the same array? I want to insert in this array. There was extended searching capabilities within an array. So you can do what's called a dictionary type search. Various encoding things. We more natively support base 64 encoding. There's a whole package for character translation encoding, transferring between UTF and OEM and moving them into different kind of variables and stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. And then we call this the Mike Pete feature. The HTTP can now support any type of verb. And that's kind of what Harm was talking about. But what that really means is it makes creating RESTful services a possibility. A big change, which I saw mentioned in training, and I also mentioned in lots of other places, is this like humble UCHAR array that nobody ever used, data type, which is it's just a byte, and you can have an array of bytes, has now become incredibly useful. And the reason it's become incredibly useful is there's no size limitation on it. So think of it like a string, but it's like the string represented as an array of characters. It can be as long as you want. So you can do things like if you want to like write something to a file, file, not a database file, but just a file, read from a file. You don't have to do this read-write thing where you're breaking it up into chunks and doing it line by line or whatever. You just say, give me the whole thing. And then when you've got it, you can move it to a string. There's a function to do that. You can bring it back from a string. And now because you're worried about the size of it, you can say, oh, bring it back from give me part of this in a string, but you can say what part of it. It just changes what's possibility. The JSON transfer class uses it. You can read and write to databases like a single UCHAR array to represent like a huge binary field and not have to worry about any kind of chunking, any kind of special anything. It just works great. The data dictionaries use it. If you're not aware of it, read up on that. The table and SQL enhancements just keep coming along. Probably the biggest one was long table name and long column names. For years and years and years, people said the names were too short. And the reason they said that is because the names were too short. This was added in 17.0, and this was a peculiar feature, which it's a really nice addition. Nobody commented on it. And I thought it was because, we figure when you don't hear from them, it means no one's using it. But everyone started using it. It just worked. It's that transparent. Lots of SQL connectivity improvements. We're supporting primary keys, clustered indexes, GUIDs. We support the Azure database much more natively. We handle large data better. The client caching has been tuned to make it faster. There's this great new great feature added a while back, auto connect. So if you lose your connection, it reconnects transparently without causing any problems. There have been improvements in embedded SQL. The fetching of data is faster, and then we even created functions that let you fetch an entire row of information or an entire set of information in a single command that returns it as an array. So lots of nice new stuff there. We have been talking so much about web that it's worth remembering that there's lots of, Windows is still important. We're still, Is there anybody here who is only running a web application right now? Yeah. Windows is going to be with us for a while, and we haven't forgotten about it. We keep improving it. Just, a couple of examples. First of all, like the font and scaling stuff. If people that had not moved up to 17.0, the best experience we had was one of our developers who put out a whole new release, and it happened to hit the new 17.0 thing, and the main comment he got from his customers about his new release was how much better the screens looked. He did all this other hard work, he did all these things, and the one change that all he had to do was recompile his application. That was the thing that everybody noticed. There's new controls. Buttons have new capabilities, new ways to put images and drop-downs and stuff like that. And views can be modal and modeless. And then, of course, the other thing is any of these changes I'm talking about that are systemic, like data dictionaries, you, of course, get in the web, you get in Windows. UChar array, you get in webs, you get in Windows. It just sort of all comes together. SOAP client services, they just keep getting improved with new releases. 18.0, there was a whole bunch of changes that made something called null and nillable data type support work. We're supporting SOAP 1.2, which SOAP 1.2 is kind of a nothing in the industry. It just never went anywhere. But there are some services that's what they're doing. Rather than trying to explain all this stuff, it's just if you're doing client, if you're consuming web services, the more recent, the closer you are to the most recent version, the less trouble you're going to have being able to successfully consume that web service. And so if you're having web service issues and you're several versions back, the first question, if you called support, they'd say, what version are you using? Studio and the debugger keeps getting better. We added this table viewer, which you've seen numerous times. Just bring the table up and you can just see what's in there. That was a big missing feature from the Studio. There's this thing called Table Explorer filtering where you can filter what tables are displayed, because what we always show you is our 20 tables or 10 tables, and it looks great in a tree view. When you've got 300 tables, that tree view gets kind of big. There are ways to filter that. The table editor. As we mentioned, you can use a native table editor, or you can use our table editor with SQL. With SQL, when you use our table editor, it's going to feel much more like a native editor because you're going to see the data types that were provided by SQL. Find in files has gotten just better and better. I find using the find in files dialog, I just use that all the time. Any kind of problem, you search for something in there. And so like the tables it searches for, when you get the search results, there's a toolbar now where you can just hit it and say next, 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 and it'll show you the next file. It's just like, as from a workflow point of view, big improvements. The whole to-do system has now been built into the system, so rather than just you're typing like to-do and then trying to remember it's there, there's actually a dialog, there's a little window that'll appear that'll show you all the to-do items that you've put in. With a single key, you add a to-do, and then with another keystroke, you can jump from to-do to to, and you can, it's nice. The other thing which I noticed, Henry showed this, was did you know that with drag and drop, you can now, from the class palette, that was originally created to drag and drop from the class palette to a visually modeled, like a visually modeled view. Well, you can also drag and drop right onto source code, which is really, really useful. So for all your non-visual classes and even your visual classes, you just take it, you drop it in, and there it is. The web app previewer keeps getting better and better and better, and it's really gotten so much better, it's now a designer. And the reason I'm not giving you a specific version is each new version gets more full-featured. There's this ability to do things before a compile, after a successful compile. The debugger has gotten much faster. In fact, prior to this version, when you ran under the debugger, it ran slower. Now it runs just about the same speed as running it in your regular application. Makes a big difference in sort of like your throughput. Debugger now has this thing where you can just click on something and say, add this to the watch window. It adds it to the watch window, and you're set. So And then to sort of like wrap this up, what I wanted to do was to go through for when I'm developing in the studio, these are the things that I consider to be pretty much indispensable. And you might have some other items that you'd like to add to the list, but what's more important is, are there any items here that you didn't know about that you should have added to the list? So let's, rather than just talking through them, let's see what it looks like. And what I'm actually going to do here is say thank you and all that, but let's hope you learned something from this, and let's see what we learned here. And so the first thing, just to make sure that and I'm just going to pick some random view here, is that go to definition. You right-click, you go to definition, and it just takes you to the piece of source code where you want, and then you hit that go to definition, and it takes you somewhere else, and you go, oh, it's, so where is C web default defined? And so you say go to definition. We just use this all the time, and that's when you're watching some of the samples, and how are they jumping around the code so quickly? That's what it was doing. Now, how are they jumping back so quickly? It's actually this thing where you can put a marker on it and say, remember where I came from. So then you can hit another key that says, come back there. I never, ever remember to do the marker in front of it, because when I'm trying to figure out something, I'm going backwards to find out where I want to be. When I'm done, I want to go forward. And there's this magic key, which is called Control-Shift-Q, that just takes you right back. It just remembers where you were and drops you back. And so I use go to definition and then Control-Shift-Q. And I actually had to look up what the Mark one was, which turned out to be Control-Q, but it's, that's my workflow. I'm assuming we all know about code sense, and that's where you're watching how do these guys type so well. You type something and then you see web, you type control space, and it brings up a list of whatever it is you're looking for, and it just types it for you, cases for you. I'm assuming you all know about that. There's a control space and a control J version. One autofills, the other always presents the list. And one of the keys does one, and one of the keys does the other, and I can never keep track of what it is. I usually hit control space, and if that doesn't do what I want, I hit control J. But that probably says more about what I can remember. There's this like quick open that whenever this got added, where you can just type whatever file you're looking for. And so if I wanted to see, C web accordion card, there it is. I open files in here all the time. It's just because it crosses directories, it crosses libraries, it crosses everything. It just finds the file for you. Opening Windows Explorer. Steve mentioned that he uses the dashboard to open, to get into Windows Explorer. You can do it all over the place. If you go to a tab and say, and press the context menu, one of the options is open containing folder. And it opens a containing folder, and it takes you to that file. I use that all the time. That's how I find out. That's how I get to my folders. And there's also one in Table Explorer because we use it so much. It takes you to the directory you want to go. It gets you into Windows Explorer. If you're not using that, that will change your life. The one thing where your web app will not be behaving the same as the samples that we were doing was you will have noticed that when Harm was doing stuff, or actually any of the web app things, is that he would compile the program, run it, but the browser did not come up. He then had to start the browser, And what would happen if you just took a standard install is when you hit the compiler, it would start the program and it would bring up your browser automatically. And we did that by default because it feels right. That's what you expect, is I want the browser to come up. As soon as you've spent like 1 or 2 hours doing web app development, you want to shut that off. And what you want to do, and you do that by going into Tools, Configure Studio, and there's this option under General called Open App Web App URL in Browser when debugging. Why don't you want that? Well, the reason you don't want that is because when you're running a web app, if you don't close it, if you just leave the browser open, you can then change your program, recompile it, run it again, go back to your browser, hit the refresh button, and you're right back where you're kind of back where you started, but you don't have to do a login again. It's just, it's a faster way to do development, that you're not constantly reloading, and you're keeping like, it's just, for example, if I say open the application, and there it is, and then I go back to my thing and say, well, I would have been happier if I'd put some spaces in my source code. And then recompile it. When I go back to the browser now, all I have to do is go refresh, and I'm right back where I was. I'm not having to do a login or anything like this. It just makes for faster development. So like once you kind of get settled into web app, that's what you want to do. The other piece for me that is one of the essentials is the Control F7 key, and I'm sure there's another item for it, but when you press Control F7, what it does is it sort of synchronizes everything in your code. So you've gone somewhere, you've made a change, and now your web property is no longer up to date. You don't know where you are on Code Explorer. What you can do is press Control F7, get yourself in a procedure wherever you are. It knows what object you're in, and it knows where you are in Code Explorer. And on top of that, it also you use that to when you're doing visual design. It's documented. Everything is there, but it's one of these things I find myself in doing web app actually any development all the time, in order to see what's going on in Code Explorer and see what's going on in the property panel, get it all synchronized. Go to a piece of source code, Control F7, you're up to date. That's another workflow thing. And then just a couple of other ones. You all know that you can run multiple studios at the same time, right? Once you start doing that, the biggest problem you have is you'll have so many studios running. You can figure out you can only run a studio in one workspace at the same time. But if you have multiple workspaces, you can leave them all open. And we'll find ourselves having studios open for days in different workspaces. So it's a nice feature. And then just two things to be aware of in the debugger, and I won't show up, but just be aware of in case you didn't know, is in the debug, when you're looking at the debugger, there is a variable window, and there's even a file table windows, local and global variable windows, and a watch window. You can edit the values in those. So if you have like a variable that's a certain value, and for debugging purposes you want to change it to something else, you can do it. Just go in, click, change the value. The other thing you can do is you can move the instruction pointer, so that if you're in a procedure and you were stepping through something and then you realized, oh, I just stepped over this and I think this is what I wanted to look at. Some cases, if you're careful, you just move the instruction pointer back up and say continue, step in, and now you can step into it. Or if you're running a loop or something and you say, I'm done with this loop, I see what it wants to do, you can step out of it. Setting the instruction pointer is a really nice, powerful feature. I bring that up because not that long ago I gave a presentation on how to track down problems and was doing this, changing the instruction pointer and changing variable values, and people said, oh, I had no idea you could do that. You can. And that's this talk. You don't need to applaud because I'm the next talk as well.
I'll applaud anyway.
Yeah, right.